Our segment 3 this evening. On the 4th of July, people used to listen to political speeches, but now politicians generally are held in low regard, and it shows, because at many of this year's holiday rallies, people seem more interested in the barbecue and the coleslaw, as in Demopolis, Alabama, where in this year's election, for the first time since 1954, there is not A. Wallace on the ballot for governor, and they're still not interested. Tom Pettit is in Demopolis.
With or without George Wallace, politics in Alabama historically has been a way of life. But on this 4th of July, apathy is epidemic, even at an elaborate 3rd of July political rally in the town of Demopolis, which means city of the people. The people seem disinterested in who runs their lives or their land.
This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Islands, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf.
You guys are old enough to vote. We just elected you.
What are you doing? Same line, close? Yeah.
This land was made for
Sidney Jackson.
It was very hot in Confederate Park, nearly 100. More than 20 candidates for public office came to speak. From tax collector to U.S. Senate, they asked for votes in Alabama's September primary.
Ethics is popular when you're running for election, but it's not popular when you're in office.
Unfortunately, only about 5 to 10% of the people really care who is elected. The only thing they care about is their own pocketbooks and how issues and answers affect them directly.
Millions of dollars in assets.
Demopolis is a city of 8,500 and therefore worth the effort for a candidate or his operatives. Voter turnout in the past has been high, both black and white. Still, the crowd was almost outnumbered by the candidates. Even with hot races for governor and for 2 U.S. Senate seats, interest is obviously running low.
I think the theme of government should be... I think the day, I hope, has gone that you can win an election for governor in Alabama with a mop bucket and a country band. And it wasn't in my lifetime that's been done. And I think that day is gone, I hope.
As far as politics are concerned, we get very little of the cake. We get a few crumbs that are thrown our way in the county and in the state and national elections, all 3 of them.
I think the main thing that's on everybody's mind is inflation and what it affects, how it affects them. Most people are concerned with things that affect them, and inflation hits everybody. And at the same time, I think they want to hear from politicians that they're going to curb spending and not necessarily that with their checks and whatnot, but I think that they want to hear something that would lead them to believe that inflation would be slowed down.
Inflation hit the old barbecue chicken lunch. $3 for coleslaw, beans, and cold barbecue. $3. Demopolis was awash in cold chicken and warmed-over speeches.
County, Alabama. Thank you so very much.
They don't say anything that the people don't want to hear. They address themselves only to trying to get votes by saying whatever the voters want to hear, and it's been like that as long as I can remember.
Merely moved out of the sun.
Well, did they really want to hear John Baker, U.S. Senate candidate, say this?
As hot as it is, I'm not going to stand here and talk to you a lot about issues. I won't take any additional time today talking about issues.
Or Congressman Walter Flowers running for the Senate.
Cabinet. I know where the Oval Office is. I can get down there and get in there and either agree or disagree with him and get his attention on any subject matter at any time.
Or the candidate who promised to do something, anything. Or another who promised it ain't gonna rain no more. So much for political promises. And the 3rd of July in Demopolis. Like a summer thunder shower, a political malaise has fallen on Demopolis and maybe beyond. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Demopolis, Alabama.
Well, Phil, I think we have a chance to have a good team. We have a senior-dominated team, which is, I guess, if you take over a program or part of the people taking over a program, you'd rather have a good freshman team. But we have real good seniors, maybe 6 or 7 real outstanding senior players. So I think we have a chance to have a good team this year if we don't have too many injuries.
You had a good recruiting year. Are you going to have to count on some of those guys?
Well, we don't really know what kind of recruiting year we had, Phil. We got in so late. We only had a week before signing date. I'm not sure what kind of freshman group we have, but we'll have to use some of them on the varsity. I don't know exactly how many yet. Some defensive backs, I feel like, for sure.
Republican Congressman Bill Dickinson said today the impact of the tax-cutting Proposition 13 is now being felt by some members of Congress. The Alabama congressman said a few small cost-cutting measures made by Congress is indicative of the new cost-cutting attitude created by the California vote. However, Dickinson said legislation may be introduced in Congress for a nationwide Proposition 13, but in his opinion, such a measure will not clear Congress.
There have been a number of constitutional amendments offered, not dealing with tax problems as did Proposition 13, because this had to do with real property taxes. But I am reading more and more, and I think you are too, about constitutional amendments that would tie and limit federal expenditures to a balanced budget, that would, through our Budget Act, prohibit the expenditure just as states are doing, and just as the state of Tennessee has a constitutional amendment right now that will prohibit the expenditures by the legislature to more than their anticipated revenue. It is mandated, and some states have always had a constitutional amendment to prohibit expenditures over anticipated revenues. I think that there is a momentum for this. I don't think that it will pass in the near future. But I think that there is a growing sentiment for it, and if we ever got an administration that supported it, and this is the big if, I don't see either an incumbent Democrat or Republican president inheriting the mess that he does when he comes in office that would turn right around and say, hey, I would like to support a constitutional amendment that would prohibit expenditures to the level of income. We had the Budget Reform Act within the Congress that was supposed to do that, but it's not working too well. So I would say there's a great deal of sentiment. It's growing. I don't expect it to happen in the near future.
In another part of today's comments to news reporters, Dickinson said contrary to his promise to cut staff, President Carter has added over 100 people to the White House staff. Dickinson cited that as a poor example of budget watching by the nation's chief executive. This is Norman Lumpkin, WSFA TV News reporting.
Phil, I think it's a accumulation of a whole lot of work by a whole lot of people. I would like to take all the credit for it, but I cannot. We had, as you know, some fine spring sports programs. I think primarily it was a result of Auburn University's commitment to be competitive. If we were going to field a team in any of these programs, then we would like to have a good team. So we decided shortly after my return that a couple of things we had to do. First, we had to provide sufficient funds for these programs, which primarily meant provide scholarships. We had always given a few scholarships, but more or less a partial scholarship program until that time when we decided we would go the full NCAA limit on scholarships. So our talent has picked up considerably since those days. Secondly, we decided that some of our coaches in those sports needed more time to coach. For example, prior to Coach Eddie Reese joining our swimming program, Coach Bill Washington was a full-time teacher and did a fine job in the time he had coaching the swimming program. But we realized that the coaches needed more time and they needed scholarships, and the two put together with a whole lot of hard work and a whole lot of support by a whole lot of Auburn people have paid off for us. I think the financial health is very good, Phil. It's certainly better than it's been in a couple of years. We're seeing a resurgence, I think, in private support as well as in gate receipts. At the same time, I would certainly be quick to add that all of our programs cost more than they ever have with the inflation that we're all experiencing and what have you. We're finding new sources of funds, new people that want to help within the university and without the university. And this is making a difference in funding our very large and very expensive program.
Are there UFOs? I doubt there will be any definite conclusion at the end of this 2-minute narrative. Dr. J.N. Eastman of the Archives and History Department at Air University in Montgomery says a 20-year study concludes that UFOs are no threat to the nation's security. Eastman told Montgomery Kiwanians that most people have seen objects they could not explain, and it's apparently logical that if we knew what they were, then there would be no UFOs. World War II pilots reported seeing unexplainable objects.
I think what they were seeing was something we call plasma electricity or plasma lightning, ball lightning more likely. If you, for example, in the Midwest, and I've never seen any down here, but I have seen it once in the Midwest, in the area of high electrical lines, given the right atmospheric conditions, you'll see a building of something that appears to be a large blob around these lines, and it will expand and sometimes break off and go out into the atmosphere away from the lines themselves.
Eastman said there was no overt hostility associated with what they saw, so many thought it was part of psychological warfare. Is this a flying aircraft, or is it something a person cannot identify?
This is a rather unusual phenomenon. I was quite surprised when I saw this piece of film. Back in 1967, we were filming a
Air Force exercise, or a joint Army Air Force exercise. And all of a sudden this thing popped up. It was a cold day, probably a lot of moisture in the air. These things, all operating together, formed a probably ice particle and water particle shield around the aircraft. And of course, if you were looking at this from the ground and you saw this happen, you would swear that you had just seen a large silvery disk pass over you at probably 500-600 miles an hour.
Eastman said the Air Force is not sitting on any information about UFOs that the public is entitled to. George Mitchell, WSFA TV News.
The one single thing that we based our case on was the fact that it was a miserably undignified situation to require that a man and a woman, strangers, should be put in a boat about twice the size of a bathtub, and they'd be expected to stay there for 9 or 10 hours a day. And it's a very undignified situation when either of them have to need to go to the bathroom. And you can't leave the boat. The security would be destroyed. And so the judge, I can only presume, recognized that situation, and as a result, hopefully that was the reason he decided for us. It's just, we don't have, a lot of people say, oh, you're against the ladies. Well, listen, we have a lot of, my building right here is full of top-flight ladies that work with bass, just like I do. We have members of bass, ladies fish. We don't have a thing against ladies.
You think this favorable ruling may have indirectly helped other professional sports, such as the women's golf tour and tennis tour?
Well, keep in mind, again, we were in a very liberal atmosphere. We were in New York State, in the New York Supreme Court, very liberal interpretations. And for a guy from Montgomery, Alabama, I had my hard hat on. I was told by some of the lawyers that were reviewing this case that if the judge had ruled in her favor and he granted the request and demands she was making, that it would, and I can't give you the exact translation from a legal standpoint, but they tell me that it could have instantly broken down the barriers that protect for example, the LPGA, the Ladies Professional Golf Tour. In other words, a man could walk in there on this as a precedent and said, I want to fish the ladies tournament, and there was no way they could have kept him out.
When the Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon wandered through what is now Covington County, he was looking for the fountain of youth. Today, modern explorers still wander the county, but now the quest is for votes, particularly votes for governor. And while getting elected governor in Alabama has quite the opposite effect of the fountain of youth, nearly a dozen are seeking it vigorously. At first glance, it may not be clear why so many would work so hard in a county with only 3% of the state's registered voters and 126,500 residents to listen to all of those stump speeches. The reason is that Covington County has the best record of all counties in the state for voting with the winning candidate for governor. In fact, the past 14 governors in a row carried Covington County. Those 3% of the voters are pretty good indicators of how all candidates are doing in the statewide race for the mansion on Perry Street. In more than 50 conversations in Covington County this past week, there is no clear-cut pattern yet, but it is clear that a pattern is developing. Questioning Covington Countyans during such meetings as Lions Clubs, coffee clatches, on the street, and randomly on the telephone in Opp and Andalusia, Florala, Babby, Horn Hill, and Libertyville produced the following. Of the 9 or 10 recognized candidates for the office of governor, only 4 met with ready recognition: Baxley, Brewer, Beasley, and Fob James. Of them, Brewer was mentioned most often, but respondents also said Brewer had worked more in the South recently. Most questioned said that they were in the process of making up their minds. They wanted to hear the rest of the contenders speak on issues. 8 years ago, Albert Brewer led George Wallace in the primary, but Wallace rallied and won in the runoff and was elected governor. Brewer had made a strong impression in Covington County during that election. 3 other counties have good voting parallels with Covington County: Elmore, Chilton, and Tallapoosa. Good, but not perfect. These 3 counties missed their perfect record of Covington County in 1918, when they voted for Plain Bill Brandon. But the winner of the governor's race was Thomas Kilby. Four other counties, Butler, Crenshaw, Dale, and Escambia, have 14-1 records, but their strings don't go back as far in history. 14 counties have missed 5 out of 15 times. No gubernatorial candidate has ever carried all 67 counties in a primary, but in recent times, Governor Wallace almost did. He carried all but Macon County in 1974. As far as predictors of what's happening, don't look to Dallas County. They have more misses than any other county in the state in the governor's race. Most political pulse takers will be touching the wrists of voters in Covington County, while the politicians are pressing the flesh there. Covington is considered the best bellwether county, the most accurate predictor. So with a long summer's campaign, WSFA TV News will sample those political waters, for as the temperature rises, so will the political stock in a particular candidate. We hope we'll be able to tell you who that is. And September 5th, we'll tell you who Covington County says will be the next governor. Then in November, we'll know if their streak has been extended to 15-0. Clark Edwards reporting for Composite.
Dr. James Eastman, who heads the Archives and History Department of Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base, related what he knows about UFOs in a speech recently to a Montgomery Civic Club. Eastman said since they pose no threat to the nation's security, the Air Force ended in 1968 a 20-year study of UFOs. But he said there still continues to be reports by people of sighting strange phenomena labeled as unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Dubbed Project Blue Book, the UFO study explained almost all of the so-called UFOs as natural phenomena. The Air Force closed its study and sent its material to Maxwell, where the information was stored until it was later sent to the National Archives in Washington. What are the characteristics of some of the unknown flying phenomena? There are about as many shapes as there are reports, and can fit one of the following descriptions: red, blue, green, or orange in color, metallic, give off a soft glow, oval, egg, diamond, mushroom, or lampshade shaped. And UFOs still remain a topic of discussion.
Are there such things as UFOs?
George, I really don't know. I've never seen one, but I know a lot of people who have seen things that they could not explain and that are not explainable by known or given natural phenomena. These things could be, if we knew all of the facts, explainable. On the other hand, there are many cases where we think we know all the facts and they're still not explainable. So it's either a case of misinterpretation of what they've seen and therefore bad information being passed, or it's a case of people passing good information and we just don't know what it is.
There are people who say they have seen UFOs, and this was very prominent during World War II, especially with pilots.
Right.
What were they seeing? Were they actually seeing UFOs?
No, I don't believe they were. I think what they were seeing was something we call plasma electricity or plasma lightning, ball lightning more likely. If you, for example, in the Midwest, and I've never seen any down here, but I have seen it once in the Midwest, in the area of high electrical lines, given the right atmospheric conditions, you'll see a building of something that appears to be a large blob around these lines, and it will expand and sometimes break off and go out into the atmosphere away from the lines themselves, just sort of take off. And I really think that probably what we had in that instance had to do with the right atmospheric conditions, the altitude at which they were flying, and perhaps a type of plasma electricity which was being built up.
Is this what we're seeing? Is this pilot or this plane makes its way across the sky?
No, this is a rather unusual phenomenon. I was quite surprised when I saw this piece of film. Back in 1967, we were filming a Air Force exercise, or an Joint Army Air Force exercise. And we had taken some what we called camera pod footage from a trailing aircraft to document what was happening on this exercise. And when we got the rough, uncut film back, we were running it through at the time. I was working for the Air Force agency, which takes photography for the Air Force. And all of a sudden, this thing popped up. And it intrigued me very much at the time, and then the more I got into looking at and thinking about and talking about UFOs, I recalled it and went and got a piece of footage on it. What has happened here is that you have a high-performance aircraft coming in fairly hot on an attack against, or simulated attack against Naval Air Station at Memphis, Tennessee. Probably because of the speed of the aircraft, also because of the time of the year. It was a cold day, probably a lot of moisture in the air. These things, all operating together, formed a probably ice particle and water particle shield around the aircraft. And of course, if you were looking at this from the ground and you saw this happen, you would swear that you had just seen a large silvery disk pass over you at probably 500-600 miles an hour. And of course, given the human problem of estimating speed, you might even say 2,000 miles an hour. Most of us, including myself, are just not competent to look at something that's going at a very high rate of speed and judge the speed.
There are, and yet there are not UFOs. What sets off the excitement or interest by individuals? It comes in waves. We have a lot of it, and it dies down. It's back in the forefront. What causes this?
Well, the easy answer, and one which I have given at times, and I've heard given at times, is that it's the media interest in it. The media interest is not a cause of it, but it certainly contributes to it. If I go out tomorrow and I see a UFO and I come in and report it, and you come and interview me about what I saw, it's going to make people more conscious of, they're going to be looking in the air now. You know, do I see anything? Can I see anything? Maybe I'll see one. And if they see something that they don't understand or that they can't explain, then they're going to report a UFO. So what it does is once that first report is made, it gets people looking upward instead of down at their shoes or straight ahead on the highway. And so what you have developed is what's called a